The only places that we are streaming this right now are on Just Inform and YouTube. So make sure that you are watching from either one of those platforms. So tell your people if they're looking for it. They can find it at justinform.com at the MCSC contributor page or on YouTube at the MCSC page. Today, we have a very special guest that a lot of you are already familiar with. You know his platform, you know what he's fighting for. But we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into this guy that everybody has come to know and love, Tim Canova. How you doing, Tim?
Fine. Thanks, Niko.
No problem, man. Thank you for coming on, first of all. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for being here.
A lot of people have asked me to interview you on, 150,000 different topics. But I decided that it was finally time after you've made your switch to independent. You've been fighting election fraud. You had a pretty successful run. The results aside, quote unquote, you did a fantastic job. So where are you at right now in the campaign? How confident do you feel going forward, and just how do you feel about your decision switching to independent?
I feel great about going independent. It was the right decision. You referred to the election frauds and the last campaign, and you really can't understand the decision I made to go independent unless you understand what happened in the last campaign and the aftermath. So we ran quite a big campaign. It was, I think, maybe the largest ground game, the largest grassroots field operation in the country. At the peak, we were knocking on 10,000 to 12,000 doors a week. I defy you to find another congressional campaign that was doing that, or even a presidential campaign that was doing it in one congressional district on that scale. So we had real doubts about the final results, the official results, because our field numbers showed a much different result. A couple of months after my primary, we put in a ballot request, I should say public records request, with the Broward Supervisor of Elections to inspect the ballots. Mm-hmm. And you know the story, maybe a lot of your viewers do as well. The supervisor stonewalled us for half a year. And then we finally brought a lawsuit, and while the lawsuit was pending, the supervisor destroyed all the ballots, which we're talking about felonies under state law. Federal law, it's punishable by up to a year in prison. It's destruction of evidence in an ongoing litigation. After destroying the ballots, the supervisor lied to the court about it for more than 2 months. Yeah. So there's all kinds of illegalities that went on, and it's frustrating that there's been no consequences since then. Yeah. We've called on the governor to investigate and to replace the supervisor. We've called on the state Department of Law Enforcement, the U.S. Attorney. So
now,
we've contacted the right folks.
For those of you who don't understand how significant that is, mind you, W. Washington Schultz is a Democrat. Despite popular belief, there is a lot of politics when it comes to how law is handed out or who's being held accountable, but apparently that's not the case here. It's even though the Republicans who are kind of dominating the state right now, they're very aware of what Snipes did and how she tried to help W. Washington Schultz, but nobody's really reached back out to you about holding her accountable.
That's right, Niko, and that's I should have mentioned that the Florida governor is a Republican. The Justice Department, the U.S. Justice Department's in Republican hands. So the Republicans...
Trump is watching W. Washington Schultz like with the microscope, as we know.
So they say, but what have been the consequences? I sent letters to every Democratic Party elected official in Broward County and Miami-Dade, and Democratic Party officials all over the state, simply asking them to join me in calling for an investigation, and none of them responded. So at that point I thought, well, why would I want to stay in a closed primary? And especially when we dug into the numbers of this district, the demographics, Republicans make up only 25% of the voters in this district. Independents, 35%.
Oh, wow.
And Democrats about 40%. And those numbers are changing with every passing week and every passing month as more new voters are registering, and they're overwhelmingly registering independent or no party affiliation. Yeah. So there's no real chance that a Republican's going to win this in a three-way race. And that's what Wasserman Schultz is trying to do. She's using these scare tactics to say if you vote for Canova, it's like he's a spoiler. It'll result in a Republican getting elected.
I don't see. The only way she's been able to hold this district is if they were just undeniably blue, or at least anti-Republican, and to begin with. So the race would only be really progressive versus, or liberal versus liberal, like for any serious contention.
That's right.
So that obviously inspired you to just become independent, because strategically it just makes perfect sense.
Well, it's not just that strategically I saw a path to victory, but it also wore down on me after a couple of years that nothing had changed in the party here in Broward County. That if I go to a local Broward County Democratic Party club or committee meeting, there's still the same hostility that I'm not supposed to be able to get up and even say hello and introduce myself the way other candidates do. And of course, that's on orders from the Wasserman Schultz machine, which is, don't let that man near the microphone.
Which, by the way, I've personally witnessed these tactics being used, not only on Tim, Elijah Manley, same thing. They'll tell you that it's an open session, it's supposed to be an open discussion, but the moment they find out your party affiliation, or if they find out you're running against one of their people, Stephanie Myers dealt with something similar to that.
That's right.
I'm sure that it's non-unique to here, but there is a special type of hostility.
Well, that's true, and that hostility does wear down on a candidate. I think if not for the ballot destruction, I might have stayed in the primary, but who gets away with destroying ballots in violation of federal and state law? And that seems to be okay with this party.
Yeah. Well, Obama, remember, he laughed at the idea. It was Trump when he said he was going to challenge the election if he lost. As a person who I'm a hyper-constitutionalist, and I'm all about more access, more verification. I thought that it would have showed a little bit more character for Obama. Like, we hope that you challenge it to make sure that everybody's vote was counted.
Exactly.
That type of stuff doesn't happen here. Meanwhile, some ballots in South Florida are being thrown in the shredder. In LA, they're dealing with their own set of problems where ballots just disappeared and wound up found 6 months later.
Well, that's right, and you've got mass suppression of voters through mass purging of citizens from the voting rolls. It happened in New York. It happened in California. New York, it happened in the 2016 presidential primary. California, it just happened. And people get, 118,000 people were given provisional ballots, I think.
Yeah.
And I don't think they've even counted all the provisional ballots in California from the 2016 presidential primary.
I wouldn't be surprised by that. I know Kamala Harris, weirdly enough, not surprising, her attorney general race was actually heavily contested because she actually got beat by about 50,000 votes, and then 20 days later, she somehow miraculously found like 150,000 to beat her opponent, her Republican opponent. So let's just say California politics are a little sketchy as it is, but unfortunately, like when you're in dominantly blue areas, no matter what the state is, it's very hard to count on that infrastructure to have your back. But
this goes to an important issue nationally, of course, which is election integrity and election justice.
That's what I was just about to ask you about. How do you feel like, what's the best ways to go forward with this? Because a lot of people are getting discouraged. I
can understand why they'd be discouraged. When you don't have faith and confidence that your ballots are being counted, it's a big cause of concern.
Yeah.
Look, every European democracy, I think, now has banned the electronic voting machine.
Good.
And they just use paper ballots that are counted by hand in public.
They also have ranked choice voting.
In a lot of jurisdictions you do. I know they're trying to get that, I think, in Maine right now. It's hard to keep up with all these developments when you're running a campaign, but I think the best system would be to have paper ballots that are counted by hand in public, reported at the local precinct level right away, and then as a backup, either blockchain voting or open source, scanning the ballots and having open source software, one of those. As it is now, there's nothing transparent about the system. Here in Florida, you've got scanned images that are digitalized, which means they can be altered. They could be altered by a software manipulation. And if you ask to inspect the software, you're told no, you may not, because the software is proprietary. The software is owned by the private vendors. Who hires the private vendors? Brenda Snipes, the Broward Supervisor of Elections.
Before we start talking about creating parties and all that good stuff, I'm like, you have to understand, the parties, they already kind of set in stone the infrastructure that's keeping third parties out.
Yes.
So before we talk about creating parties and things like that, we have to really deal with this infrastructure.
Yes.
It does. If you live in a Democratic district, they are the ones who are going to count your ballots.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones who are going to throw your ballots away when they choose, and the Republicans aren't going to argue with them because they're cheating in their own way in their own districts.
Well, and that was the eye opener. For years now, the Republicans in Broward County and around the state have been very critical of Brenda Snipes. They've brought lawsuits against her. There's all kinds of concerns they've had about how she administers elections. There's been one scandal after another. I think in August of 2016, when I was on the ballot, Snipes mysteriously left off the medicinal marijuana referendum from about 100,000 ballots, I believe. And,
Wow.
Just a mistake. These are always mistakes. With mine, the destruction of the ballots in my race she claimed was a mistake. And yet, what kind of mistake is it when she certified that they were not the subject of pending litigation? We had already sued. We had already served discovery requests. She had signed a destruction order. This was no mistake, and this should be it should be investigated, and we're still calling for an investigation.
Yeah.
And
Is
the
there any
reason,
way where people can like? Is there a petition online that you
yes,
have?
if folks go to timcanova.com, there's a link right next to the issues page for election integrity and ballot destruction. If you click there, you're going to see a couple of petitions. And one is very comprehensive, and it does call for an investigation, but it also calls for paper ballots and far-reaching reforms.
Well, so on a more positive note, as
Yes.
you know, we had two progressives specifically when, 2 weeks ago, Alexandria Ocasio and Ben Jealous. And they were both able to beat out their establishment opponents. Obviously, a little bit different circumstances, because I would say that Maryland is, even though it's a blue state, it is not. It's kind of like split down the middle. They alternate between governors
Yes.
pretty regularly. And then with Ocasio, obviously, we know she beat Crowley, and he was next in line to be Speaker of the House. So, do you feel like this is emblematic of a huge change, not only necessarily in the Democratic Party, but really amongst progressives in the populist movement in general?
I'm encouraged by both results. However, Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx, New York City is not Broward County.
Absolutely.
I don't know if they've had the same kind of history and concerns about election rigging.
Oh
Okay.
yeah. Well, that was actually one of Alexandria actually brought that up in the debates,
Right, right.
which was surprising.
Right.
But
That's great that she did. I mean, we have made a big deal about the destruction of the ballots. We sued. We're still trying to press the case in court to get attorney's fees and to get the supervisor fired. And some folks are like, well, why focus on that? That's 2016. Well,
accountability is accountability.
Exactly. If you sweep it under the rug, all it does is normalize election rigging in the future.
I know there's a lot of people in jail on marijuana charges who think like that. Why are we focused on what happened in 2009, right?
Right.
Nobody ever says this.
Right.
But now, because it's inconvenient for people to, I think it's like there are some people who, they're not really forgiving of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, but they don't want to deal with the reality that election fraud and election rigging is indeed real.
Yeah.
Like they don't, because it makes them uncomfortable. It means they don't really have a choice in the way that they thought they did.
That's true. And, aside from the rigging, and Wasserman Schultz herself has said on TV that she knows how to rig primaries. That was somehow her defense. That was her defense.
If I wanted to rig a primary, I could.
I could. We could. That's what she said. Yeah. But put that aside. If you're living in Florida and you see the kinds of problems this state has and this district right now, Debbie Wasserman Schultz is a big part of all of these problems. Right now we have an environmental catastrophe that's unfolding north of here in Lake Okeechobee. 90% of the lake is now covered in toxic algae. This is not just some natural occurrence. There's man-made, human-made reasons that this has occurred. And that algae is about to start flowing out in big quantities now. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is about to open up the locks. It's going to flow out into the Caloosahatchee and to the St. Lucie rivers, all the way out to the oceans. And it happened 2 years ago. This time, the amount of algae it dwarfs what we've seen in the past. And in the past, it's killed dozens of manatees. It's killed a lot of sea life. It's sickened a lot of people. It could kill people, actually. That water is so toxic. So what are the causes of it? You see agricultural runoff, fertilizer runoff from big sugar farms and other big farming interests right into the lake. They're using Okeechobee as a dumping ground. And what would be ideal, and Florida voters approved a referendum 8 years ago, Amendment 1, to earmark $1 billion from a small real estate transactions tax to buy up the sugar farms south of Okeechobee to allow Okeechobee to start draining naturally into the Everglades.
Yeah.
It would recharge the aquifer. The Everglades, the natural vegetation of the Everglades, would act as a filtration of the phosphorus and other toxins that are in Okeechobee. But it's the big sugar families that have resisted this. And the sugar interests...
The sugar family has ran South Florida for quite some time.
All of Florida. My last campaign, I think the Miami Herald had a piece that came out that said over the last 25 years, the big sugar interests in Florida have contributed more than $50 million to Democrats and Republicans alike.
Yeah. If you want to know how serious the sugar lobbying is, do some research into why Florida, or South Florida specifically, or Miami, was Cuba's choice to the people who were rich and wealthy in the Batista regime. Ask how that legislation got passed so they could just literally walk onto Florida and be American citizens.
And these big sugar interests, they get over $100 million in federal subsidies a year.
Whoa.
Oh yeah. So Wasserman Schultz.
Nobody else can. I don't know if you know this, but as far as sugarcane is concerned, only Brazil and the United States can produce 95% of the sugar around. Other places have the climate and the agriculture to do it, but they're not allowed to. And once again, that just goes back to how big sugar has been.
How powerful they are.
Yeah.
And it's like this on issue after issue. When we want to convert to solar energy here in the Sunshine State and other renewables, we get Florida Power and Light that are in the way.
Whew.
And Florida Power and Light's parent company, NextEra, big contributors to Wasserman Schultz and to many other politicians in Florida. And they're the ones who are part of the consortium that are building the Sable Trail pipeline.
So how do you feel that you would be able to fight them from your position if you were to win? Do you think it's a fight that you could win, or with the people behind you, with the mandate from the people, that you think you could win?
This is a question that I'm asked an awful lot. If I'm elected to Congress and I'm one of 435 members of the House, and maybe one of the only ones who hasn't taken corporate money, how can you change the system? And I honestly don't have a good answer. I know that things are getting so serious that we have to speak the truth, whether we're candidates or we're elected officials.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's a good start.
I think folks could. It is a good start to speak the truth, and folks understand. I think at this point that should I end up in the House of Representatives, I'm not about to sell out suddenly.
Yeah. Could have sold out a while ago if you wanted to.
Yes.
I mean, it's very difficult to kind of bounce back from such a. I mean, y'all killed it during the election. And it's very difficult to bounce back after something like that, to seeing such great numbers and having to deal with open fraud.
Yes.
Like I said, we had President Obama mocking fraud.
Yeah.
We've had people say that election fraud is somehow conspiracy, which is weird.
Right.
I feel like anybody who's been involved in politics long enough that at all thinks election fraud, that is the norm. I would say election fraud is the norm. It's not just it's not a conspiracy. It is the standard.
Well,
moles in campaigns are the standard.
Yes.
Like, this is a normal thing. Whenever I was working for who was the governor? He was running for governor. Kenneth Spalding, actually. He was one of the attorneys on the case with OJ.
Mm-hmm.
He was running for governor. They were doing things like keeping all the black candidates off of the pamphlets for Senate, for House, and for governor. Mm-hmm. They put moles into his campaign a year and a half before the election.
We had moles in my last campaign.
Yeah.
We hired a communications director who it turned out was on Wasserman Schultz, the payroll of Wasserman Schultz's super PAC, the Patriot Majority Super PAC.
Who was that?
Chrissy Setzer was her name, inside the Beltway Communications Director.
Wow.
So there were several others.
That goes to show people you don't have these people don't have to be popular. They don't have to be all over social media just for them to be a dim operative. In fact, during my investigations, most of the people that we figured out eventually were dim operatives. They didn't even have Facebook. So
we had several people who were in the inner circle, so to speak, of the campaign. In hindsight, I guess it makes sense, but at the time you don't want to see or suspect this kind of activity. Yeah. But so soon after the campaign, 3 of them went to work for Stephen Battelle, the chair of the Florida Democratic Party.
Who was also getting sued.
The multimillionaire best friend of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and they all worked for him in one capacity or another. So it's disturbing when you have to worry about getting stabbed in the back.
Yeah. I know that Brandon DeGraff did a series on Don Ford, just because of really how high profile your campaign was, how high profile Stephen Jaffe's campaign was, and you know, it seems like once again that there are even people pretending to be in the progressive movement who nobody ever heard of before until 2017 or 2016, who continuously ruin campaigns. What example? Can you give some examples of what different tactics people have tried to use? Are they trying to give misdirection, link you with other bad people who could potentially damage you in the long run?
Well, the communications director took our money and never put out press releases at critical times when we needed press releases sent out.
Which is a big deal.
Yeah. Others may have been reporting back to DNC type of operatives. There was certainly a lot of pressure that came to bear on me when we had our primary not to officially challenge the election results. It was a very confusing moment when that happens, and I must say this has been a learning experience for me, because I think, like most people, I'm brought up to believe that our elections are fair, at least in the way the votes are counted. It's something that you kind of take for granted, and your mind doesn't want to go there. There's this cognitive dissonance that you don't want to believe that elections can be rigged at that kind of a level.
Yeah. How many examples do we know? We have Tim, obviously. Yes. We have Stephen Jaffe, which I'm sure he'll be willing to speak on what he experienced. One of Don Ford's friends was running his campaign at one point.
Well, Ford showed up at this office right in the aftermath of my last campaign and wanted to interview me. And he had sent me a couple of emails during the campaign, but I had no real contact with him. Yeah. You can imagine during the campaign I got emails from an awful lot of people, and some who wanted to meet with me. And I think some of my staff responded and tried to schedule something, but never really scheduled anything. So when I met him, I took him at his word that he was a progressive activist and doing a film, a documentary of some sort.
Yeah, because he knew everybody, and the same way he got everybody else. He touched enough rubbed enough shoulders, and you can convince anybody of anything.
I started to have doubts when he came down to South Florida and apparently helped blow up at the time a campaign of someone running for state legislature here. He did the same thing for somebody running for Congress in New Hampshire. And then Stephen Jaffe had considered hiring him, and Jaffe had decided not to hire him. And the way Don Ford lashed out at Jaffe was really over the top.
Very similar to how he lashed out at you when you announced independence.
I announced I was running as an independent, and it was over the top. He contacted me and cursed me out. Contacted me. I'm like, really?
After he went to a bunch of individual groups and started slandering, and it was almost as if he was waiting for the opportunity to do it. Yeah. That's what was really weird about it. And I didn't even know this. He was telling people that I was getting paid from the Republicans, and I was like, oh wow, I didn't know I had suddenly become Candace Owens.
Right.
But and then I found out he had another page where Sally Albright actually commented on the group saying, well, I can't talk about this loudly, but I'm just registering to show my support. Sally Albright, who has me blocked on Twitter, and Jeff Campbell blocked, and pretty much every other progressive that Tim Black has him blocked too. So these are the people that Don Ford's associating with. You even said you saw him at the convention walking with some.
Well, yes, we had an annual Democratic conference here in Hollywood Beach, and this was a year ago. And at that point, I saw him speaking with somebody very close to Stephen Battelle, one of Stephen Battelle's top lieutenants. And they seemed very chummy. I certainly at the time wondered, it certainly seemed like they had known each other very well. And his response was, well, I try to work with establishment people and to be the bridge and all of this. When I decided to run independent and he lashed out at me, he claimed that he had brokered an agreement where, I mean, this is this is laughable. That the chair of the Broward Democratic Party had agreed that they would stay neutral as long as I remained a Democrat challenging Wasserman Schultz. And I mean, this really is laughable. There was no neutrality coming from the party at all.
And for no one in Florida, by the way. This wasn't even just him.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think he might have, first of all, Don Ford, I understand his real name is not even Don Ford. Brandon Nelson. Yeah, I think he genuinely was unhappy that I went independent because I think his role and the promises he made to the establishment were probably to keep me in a closed primary where they figured they'd have an easier time prevailing in a closed primary.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, just like I said, is another example of how these things are normal in politics. I know we want to believe like what we see on TV and
well, they're normal in establishment politics. Progressives like myself, I want to debate the issues.
Yeah.
I will go anywhere to be in a public forum with other candidates to debate Wasserman Schultz, but that's not the way the establishment rolls.
Crowley didn't even want to debate Ocasio at first. And
Ocasio destroyed him in that one debate they had. That was wonderful to see.
She destroyed his lackey first, and then he had to finally address the issues, and same thing. Then you ended up having to debate. You finally got to debate.
Well, after all the absentee ballots had already been cast, so 2 weeks away from the actual primary date, and Wasserman Schultz, who I had been hounding her for a debate for months.
Literally months, yeah.
Suddenly I read in the newspapers that she had agreed to a debate and they were waiting for me to agree. And she was tweeting out.
Was that written by Tony Mann?
Could have been, probably. And Wasserman Schultz was trying to taunt me by tweets that she's in. Where are you, Tim?
Yeah, literally. Yeah. The whole world had been tweeting her up until that point to debate. It was like a hashtag, if I recall, at one point on Twitter.
Yes. Well, Debbie Dodge's debates was one of them. So, and the thing is, I should say that while she's taunting me, the debate that she originally came up with one of her establishment mass media cronies was a half an hour early on a Sunday morning after commercial interruption. Maybe we have about 15 minutes to debate. So they were shocked that I originally said, no, you should be ashamed of yourself for suggesting a 15-minute debate. Yeah. And we got it up to, after commercial interruption, maybe 30 minutes or so.
That's good.
She's still dodging debates. We had a candidates forum that was hosted by the Communication Workers of America, local here in Pompano Beach. And a couple of Republicans showed up, and I was there, and of course Wasserman Schultz was not. Yeah. So, the establishment, and Wasserman Schultz is a quintessential establishment candidate. They will load up on a lot of corporate money. They'll spend it on consultants. They'll spend it to buy off certain people and to try to plant moles into your campaign.
Yep.
And they'll, try to do everything but debate.
Well, hopefully you will be able to power through and conquer this beast that is the Democratic Party.
Well, it's been a long road, Niko. When I first announced I was running in 2016, it was January of 2016. Mm-hmm. I am now on my 31st month. I'm tired, but the finish line's within reach, and I think as the primary season comes to an end, there are fewer and fewer interesting progressives left standing.
Yeah.
There's still a few good ones out there. There's no doubt. Zephyr Teach out and Cynthia Nixon in New York, but
Lindsay in Texas. It's Lindsay. I can't remember her last name, but yeah, she's good too.
I give a shout out for my friend in California, Maria Estrada, running for state legislature.
Kenneth Mejia.
Yes, Kenneth Mejia is also running. Excellent candidate.
If he wins, by the way, people, he would be the first Green Party candidate in U.S. Congress in history.
And
he's good for him.
And he's also a young man.
Yeah. He's about my age, 27, 28 years old.
I think so. Yeah.
So on a more lighthearted note before we go, a lot of people don't know about you that you are in fact vegan and into the health. Like Tim is a health nut. And
I don't look at myself that way.
See, that's how you know somebody's a health nut when they don't see themselves as one.
Yes.
Okay, so what made you decide to become a vegan? How long?
Well, many years ago, I was a lawyer in New York, and as a lawyer in New York City, I had a typical lawyer lifestyle, which is you work like a dog and you live like a rat. Small little apartment and a lot of tough hours. And one night after work, I'm in Manhattan, in my neighborhood where I was living, just going out to grab a quick bite to eat. And I did something I hardly ever did. I walked into a McDonald's and I got a Big Mac. And within 2 days, I was in a hospital emergency room and having an emergency appendectomy. So,
were you a vegetarian before
no,
that?
I wasn't. And I went vegetarian after that. And, the health effects were immediate. My blood pressure, my cholesterol, all that stuff. I have never been on any prescription drugs for any of that. And all that improved dramatically by going vegetarian. And then some years later, I was a law professor in Southern California. And
all over, man.
I'll tell you, when I went into teaching, my scholarly agenda was Wall Street, the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund. And it was very critical of these institutions at a time when it was not popular yet to be critical of these institutions. In 1996, I had a top editorial of the day, not a letter, but the top editorial in the New York Times criticizing Alan Greenspan, who Clinton was just about to reappoint as chairman of the Federal Reserve. And you would think being at the very top of the New York Times would be something that would help. It really didn't.
When does it ever?
Greenspan was at the height of his popularity, and it was seen as somehow old thinking to be criticizing the free market approach of Greenspan. But I say that just to mention that I moved around the country to get tenure. I got tenured at the University of New Mexico, and the whole time was trying to get back to South Florida, where I had started my teaching career.
Gotcha.
When I was in Southern California, the school I was teaching at had a need for someone to teach animal law. So I jumped in to teach it, and two of my students were vegan, and they approached me and asked me why I wasn't. So they turned me on to some of the alternatives.
You got the Jehovah's Witness approach. Hi, have you met your Lord and Savior?
So I've been on a plant-based diet ever since, and I swear by it. It's good for the planet, it's good for the animals, and it's good for our own health.
That's good stuff.
Yeah.
I know that the world always, and you'll never probably find out. Everybody tries to figure out if you're 35 or 85 or a vampire or, which is a great thing, man.
People are asking that about me?
Yeah, all the time, man. Everybody's like, well, how old do you think you is? Figure it out. Ask them. I don't know. They'll tell you. But it's just awesome to see that you put so much time into your campaign and you still take so much time to take care of yourself, because it's a very difficult thing for really anybody to do.
Yeah.
And the last thing is, just before we go, what made you run that first time? You obviously had a successful career as a professor.
Yeah.
You were a great lawyer, and so what made you say, you know what? Yeah, I'm just going to throw my hand into this and see how it works out.
So I am a tenured law professor at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Davie, Fort Lauderdale. And as a professor over the last couple of decades, I've been very active in politics. Actually, even before going to law school, I worked on Capitol Hill for 2 years as a legislative aide to a Democrat, to the late U.S. Senator Paul Tsongas. He was from Massachusetts. So much of my scholarly agenda has been very connected to politics. When you write about the Federal Reserve and the International Monetary Fund and all of these global institutions. So I'd been very active in campaigns, and not just for candidates, but for causes. In 1999, there was this groundswell of protest in this country and around the world, first centered against the World Trade Organization, but it was really kind of a critique of a lot of these global institutions and corporate globalization. So I was
that seemed to always benefit one group of countries, but always screw over everybody else.
Well, and not just groups of countries, within each country. The system benefits the top 1%. A country like the U.S., you could say that some of these trade agreements have helped the U.S., but it's really helping a certain strata of U.S. society. So I was active in those protests. I was active in the Occupy Wall Street I was in Southern California, and I was at the Occupy Los Angeles encampment teaching a workshop on the Federal Reserve in Wall Street. And right around the same time, I got a call from Senator Bernie Sanders' office asking me to serve on an advisory committee on reforming the Federal Reserve. So
Bernie's aware of how, all the critiques of the Federal Reserve.
Sure. Yes, he is. And the year before, as a professor, before the Occupy moment happened, I was working with Bernie's staff and the staff of Ron Paul and Alan Grayson, just on one sort of group of provisions in the Dodd-Frank Act, and that was the transparency provisions for the Federal Reserve. So I know his staff was very aware of the work that I was doing on the Federal Reserve for a lot of years. Now listen, I should say I never thought I was going to run for a political office. It's not something I desired. I thought I'm not a wealthy man, and I don't have the money, and who am I going to raise money from? And things started shifting in 2015. I got active with the Citizens Trade Campaign, lobbying against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I was specifically writing about the investor-state dispute settlement provisions that give investors the right to sue, to challenge national and state and local regulations in front of foreign arbitration panels. And I tried to get the attention of my local congresswoman and her staff, and I couldn't. And that was the eye-opener for me. The more we started digging, the more we saw Wasserman Schultz had taken over $330,000 from corporate interests that wanted the TPP. She wouldn't answer our calls. We were left out in the parking lot protesting outside of her office in Pembroke Pines, and she was the only Democrat in Florida's House delegation to vote to fast-track the TPP. And that was the moment, right around spring to summer of 2015, where a core group of us started to think, this is what's wrong with politics in this country and with the Democratic Party. This is a very safe Democratic district, and if Wasserman Schultz is not challenged in a primary, that means she can go on doing what she's doing. It wasn't just the TPP. We realized she's been taking millions of dollars from big Wall Street banks and fossil fuel companies and private prison companies, you name it. And sounding on TV like a liberal because she's attacking whoever, Mitt Romney and Donald Trump and whoever, but in her actual legislative agenda, she's carrying the water for all of these big corporate interests. So we thought somebody's got to challenge her in a primary, and we started to look around, put together a list, you could say, of state legislators, local mayors, commissioners. Nobody would step up to challenge her, of course, because she was the chair of the Democratic National Committee.
Yeah, they knew how that would go.
And these friends of mine, they became friends.
And they know she had Brenda Snipes in the picture, and like they've been controlling elections around here for quite some time. Especially because it's for Florida specifically, in this district specifically, there's a lot of money in schools that goes magically disappearing.
Yeah.
Because this is one of the largest, the first or the second highest funded district in the country.
The public schools here are in terrible condition. The teachers are.
There's no excuse for it.
There's no excuse. They're not paid very much at all. The teachers, they have very tough teaching schedules. They've got to dip into their pocket to buy supplies for their students. The class sizes are too big, and there's mold and mildew in the classrooms that are making students and teachers sick every week. Wow. And the money is there. It almost seems as if this is a plan to make the public schools fail so that they're ripe for the picking for the charter school, the privatization agenda.
Which she also makes money from. Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, nice. So,
in 2015, these folks, the friends I was making at the Citizens Trade Campaign, started to urge me to run. And, at first I thought, this is ridiculous. How can I run against the head of the DNC? Again, I don't have money. And I was very busy teaching in the classroom in the fall of 2015, and I said, I'll think about it more seriously at the end of the semester. The semester ended, and December of 2015 is when Wasserman Schultz used her DNC to try to block Bernie Sanders' campaign from having access to the van voter database. Yeah. And that was the pivotal moment for me. That's when I decided I'm jumping in. And I must say, I was very inspired by Bernie Sanders. To see this man over 70 years old, putting it all out on the line, calling for other people to step up. And I thought, this is exactly what's needed, is somebody who's going to challenge Wasserman Schultz, make her feel the heat, and make it harder for her to keep rigging this thing against Bernie Sanders. And I really had faith.
You did end up having to distract her. You were a big, part of why she probably couldn't be as involved as she wanted to.
I was a big thorn in her side. There's no doubt. We stripped the bark off the tree. I think had we not run, I doubt she would have been pushed out of the DNC.
Absolutely.
We created a lot of noise around her and really shined the spotlight on her record of all the things that she had been doing, not just the rigging. So I'm very proud of the campaign we ran. I always felt from the day I jumped in that I wasn't going to have to do call time and beg for money. That I do ask for money, but I ask for small donations online from the people in my district and people around the country. And we had a very successful fundraising campaign the first time. It's more challenging in an off-year election like this, but it's beginning to perk up since we went independent. And I'm urging folks to go online, timcanova.com.
He's not with Act Blue anymore, by the way.
No more Act Blue, it's Action Network. So spread some love our way, and know that we're going to be fighting all the way to November, and we're not going to let them rig this election. If I've said, I was quoted when I qualified to be on the ballot, that if we lose this by 1 vote or by 10,000 votes, we're going to challenge it.
There we go.
Yeah.
There we go. Well, Tim, appreciate you coming on.
Thank you,
We'll
Niko.
Definitely do this again soon.
Appreciate
like you said, people, go to timcanova.com, donate to his campaign. You heard he used your money the right way last time. Knocked on over $12,000 a week.
$12,000 a week.
That's what they were averaging last time. And so you can have confidence knowing that he treats your money as if he was spending it on from his own pocket. In other words, there are a lot of people that are saying he should have stayed in the Democratic Party. If he would have did that, maybe some of you would have had a good enough excuse to, I don't know. This man left the party. He left Act Blue because he doesn't want to waste your money, nor your time, nor the time of the volunteers or his staff, nor his own. He is in it clearly to win it. And even though they've had a lot of success last time, now Tim is going for the gold. And this year, and really for 2020, we need as much help in the House as we can get. No pun intended. So with that being said, thank you all so much for tuning in to this cast of Mi Casa Es Su Casa. Remember, more than anything else, find your balance. Peace.